Hello, class. So I just talked for 10 minutes on my lecture today before I realized I didn't have my microphone in and my headphones. So I have to redo the first 10 minutes of my lecture. So, so with this unit today, we're getting into what is often called, what is referred to as post-communist or post-socialist. Sometimes it's also called the transition period in Polish society, history and society, being the transition from a planned Soviet communist economy to a free market capitalist economy. And the consequences that has on culture, not just on economy, but on culture, society, and other areas of life. I'm just going to start sharing a whiteboard. It's unfortunate because that first 2 minutes was really good, and now I doubt that I'll be able to recreate it. But anyway, so the 1990s then in Poland, sometimes called post-communist, sometimes post-socialist, sometimes called the transition period, sometimes called all three in the same article, journal article or whatever. So I mentioned last time a phrase, shock therapy. So when Solidarity comes into power in government, they decide to follow a model of shock therapy into capitalism, out of communism into capitalism, meaning they got rid of safety features for businesses overnight almost, and put them on the open market. So businesses that had been state funded, state operated for the most part, state owned, were sold off very quickly. Now, this method has its defenders. There are some economists who defend this even today, even after the what history shows us. They still defend Poland following this model, but there are also a lot of detractors, a lot of people who criticize this, and not every country in that area who went through the transition followed this model. Some of them took a much slower, even approach. For example, the Czech Republic did not just overnight sell off all of its state-owned properties. They decided to transition much more slowly so as not to go through as much pain as Poland had to go through. So the reason that there are defenders of shock therapy is because it was really good for business. It was really good for corporations. They sold off, state-owned enterprises like the Lenin shipyards, which are now named something else. I think they're just called Ship or something. But they sold that off to the highest bidder. And as if you look at the stock market of the time, if you look at Poland's entrance into the global economy, into globalism, it was really good. But even in this country, we quite often see that what's good for corporations and what's good for the Dow or for the stock exchange isn't always good for workers. In fact, very rarely is it good for workers. And the same is true in Poland. So when Poland began selling off all of its state-owned enterprises, the genius of capitalism is efficiency, right? Efficiency is the most important. The bottom line and profit is the most important point of the existence of a free market corporation, a corporation that finds itself in a free market economy. And so, in order to make money, to improve its bottom line, corporations fire people. And there was a huge amount of firing happening in the 1990s. It's been, the irony of the Lenin shipyards is a great example. This is where the Solidarity movement came out of. And almost overnight, just about everyone in Gdańsk is unemployed because they've sold off the shipyard to a private enterprise, and the private enterprise understands that they can't keep this many people working. There isn't, the demand. There isn't the need for as much product or as many working hours as the communist government had supported. Under communism, you were employed. Period. You know, if all you were doing was sitting at a desk and putting a stamp on a piece of paper, you were employed, right? You weren't guaranteed certain things. You know, of course, the problem was there was nothing to buy, but you had employment. After, you know, in the 90s, as I mentioned in the last lecture, you see a huge increase in joblessness. Unemployment rate in 1998, 8 years, almost a decade after the fall of communism, unemployment was still at 25%, which is just gigantic in American terms. And so that you get a lot of troubles happening in Poland at this time. People out of work, poverty just, you know, it skyrockets. The rate of poverty skyrockets. But the bottom line is doing really well, and that's why it's defended by some economists, is because the bottom line of Poland's GDP was improving. Never mind that, you know, people, you know, were dying of, you know, poverty-related diseases, and homelessness was, you know, which had never been seen in communism, suddenly becomes a stark reality in Poland. So it you know, it has its defenders, but it also has its critics. So with the fall of socialism, we also see another phenomenon begin to take place, and this is where we get into the author I want to talk about today, which is Olga Tokarczuk. So with the fall of socialism, especially in Poland, you see a rise in culturally conservative ideologies. So the funny thing, I guess ironic thing, I don't know if I'm using irony right, about the era of the era of Soviet communism having so much influence in the region, is that it kept a lot of traditional, more traditional views of family and society kind of down. You know, and this happened all over the Soviet Union sphere of influence. This is a really drastic example, but I believe this was, I want to say Mongolia, but I could be wrong. It could be like one of the stands, like Kazakhstan or somewhere, or Uzbekistan. Following the fall of communism in all these areas, and the you know the loss of the influence that the Soviet Union had on this region, you begin to see this practice from, like, you know, very traditional societies begin to pop up in areas, and one of them was the idea of stealing your bride. So you know, if we think to, like, you know, the medieval ways of thinking, I guess you could, you know, you can see how this could be allowed, but really it's just mind blowing that this was taking place in the 20th century. But for example, you were expected as a young man to go to a woman's house, kidnap her, and keep her in your house. And if you kept her in her house for 24 hours, she was your bride, right? So this kind of thinking all of a sudden begins to pop up again in the vacuum that's left with the fall of the Soviet Union and communism as an ideology in the area. You get these very socially conservative ideas begin. You begin seeing these very socially conservative ideas begin popping up again, and the same is true in Poland. Now, there wasn't the, you know, stealing of brides, but, you know, that's just a very drastic example I want to give of the time. But you definitely see very anti-feminist movements and chauvinistic propaganda begin popping up. The nationalist fervor, the kind of nationalist ideologies that we saw in, you know, pre-World War II and maybe during World War II that had been repressed by communists begin showing their face again. So, for example, in post-communist and transition Poland, you see the rise of a political party called the Liga Polskich Rodzin, or LPR, so the League of Polish Families. Very conservative, reactionary group. They never got that big, but they had such a they got voted a high enough number of people into parliament that they were actually given a junior partnership in the government by Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, or PIS, Law and Order, which is or Law and Justice, which is the party in control right now. And this would have been unheard of during communism. It's this very family values, those catchwords, family values, traditional values type of parties. Very racist, very nationalist. The guy who started LPR was actually, his father was a close ally of a guy named Roman Dmowski, and you may remember this name from one of the short documentaries I had you watch about the independent Poland movement period. And he was a raving anti-Semite. If he had been German, he would have been a member of the Nazi Party. I mean, there's just no doubt about that. So, and so you see this kind of ideology pop up again in post-communist Poland. And women are also, so under communism, women were often given important leadership roles. It was, and ethnic minorities were also protected. During communism, you would have seen women in leading roles in the party, leading roles in local government. But after communism, this really starts to fade away. Women begin taking a back seat again, or being forced into the back seat, being forced back into the kitchen again with the rise of these ideologies. And one author of the time who a lot of her work has fought against this, and not the story that we read for today, but and a lot of her other work, you really see her working against these new reactionary movements that are popping up in the 90s. Olga Tokarczuk. She is probably the most important she's the most important contemporary author in Poland. In 2018, so just a couple of years ago, she won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And you would think that when a compatriot, a fellow citizen of your country, wins the Nobel Prize in Literature, that's a point of pride for you. That would be a point of pride for other Poles, right? A Polish person just won this prestigious award, this internationally renowned award. You would think that Poles would be proud of that. But the conservative government of Poland absolutely excoriated her in the press when she won this prize, because her work refuses to let Poland off. The history of Poland in the 20th century is tragic, but as I talked about during our unit on the Holocaust and World War II, there were also Polish villains. There were Polish victims and there were Polish villains. The conservative government of today would like to only remember the Polish victims. They have no desire whatsoever to admit that there were some Poles involved in some of the murder. In fact, they say that it's anti-Polish, and there are even laws. They've tried to pass laws. All of them have been struck down by European government. But like human rights, European human rights commissions and whatnot have struck down the laws whenever they tried to be enforced. But still, they would rather completely forget any involvement Poland had in the murder during this period. And Tokarczuk refuses to just let Poland be nothing but the hero or victim, right? There were also perpetrators among Poles, and a lot of her work deals with this to a certain degree. Deals with the idea of making Poland come to terms with the truth of itself. And conservatives historically have never liked to have to admit to the truth of things. So if we look at the story itself, 1 second, it's my thing. So I just want to go over a couple points, and then I'm going to ask you to do a close reading of part of it. So this is. Find it. Yes, Professor Andrews goes to Warsaw. So, so this takes place in 1980, December 1980, and as good Polish historians, we know what is about to happen in December of 1980. And the way she writes this professor character is so brilliant. He's, you know, the journey he's forced to go on is something that he is not prepared for, right? But at the beginning of the story, he, you know, we can easily see that he thinks of himself as this very important person, that he is the kind of the one of the founders of this new school of psychology. And what's interesting also to know is that Tokarczuk's training is actually in psychology. Her education was in psychology, and then she was also a therapist for a little while, I think. Um, so she creates this character of Professor Andrews, an English psychologist, and he has this very high opinion of himself, right? Um, so he comes to Warsaw to give a lecture in 1980. So the first thing I want to point out that really kind of illustrates his kind of arrogance, his cultural arrogance too, is on page 303. He says, it's near the top of the page, he saw his Beatrice at once. So he's in the airport in Warsaw, and he describes it as, you know, this gray place, this, you know, kind of this place that's stuck in, you know, an older, darker time. And then he says he sees his Beatrice. Now, her name is not Beatrice. This character's name is not Beatrice, but this is where Foster, from the beginning of the semester, if you remember, where your past knowledge of things you've read or of cultural touchstones comes into play, right? So why does he call her Beatrice? You know, as a good reader, you should ask yourself, why does he say Beatrice when we find out later her name is something else, right? Well, if you were paying attention in English class in high school, you'll know that Beatrice comes from Dante's Inferno. Or, actually, it's a poem, so I should probably put in quotation marks. Or what is often called, what its true title is the Divine Comedy. So, actually, I will put this in quotation marks because it's only one part of the Divine Comedy. So there are three parts to Dante's Divine Comedy. Il Inferno, I think it's Il, I'm not sure, it's Italian. La Purgatorio, or something like that, and Paradiso. So it's hell, purgatory, and heaven. And so Dante tells a story of trying to find Beatrice. But to find Beatrice, he has to go through hell first. So what does that say about his opinion of the Warsaw airport? It tells us that he thinks this is hell, right? That he has this, you know, it automatically gives us insight into his attitude about this place that he's visiting, right? That it is backwards, that it's hellish, it's like a hellscape that he has to, you know, struggle through, right? So it's all these, you know, just with this one mention, you know, this one inference into a different work, right? Beatrice. We now have much deeper insight into who this person is, what he thinks about, you know, this Poland that he's just found, right? Doesn't speak a word of the language or anything, but he already has an opinion of the place. So that's something to keep in mind as you read through this. And then this thing happens. And we know what happens, right? So the story is really, you know, it's kind of, you know, I'm going to separate this. It's this genius move on the part of Tokarczuk as an author. Um, it's almost like she was writing this story for an English speaker who knows Polish history, right? So, a Pole would read this and get something out of it and kind of chuckle, but an English reader who knows a bit about Polish history is kind of put in the place of Professor Andrews, but with more knowledge than Professor Andrews has. So what do we know as the reader? We actually know more than Professor Andrews, and this is a genius move. This is the reader almost becomes part of the story, takes part in the story because they have more knowledge than the main character. So we know that martial law has been enacted, right? As good Polish historians, we know that when we see December 1980, right, and we know when we see when we read that he wakes up one morning and the phone is dead, the TV isn't working, he sees soldiers in the streets. We know as readers that martial law has just happened. He has no clue. He has no idea. He can't talk to anyone. He can't find anything out. He has no access to the outside world, to news or anything. So as far as he's concerned, the apocalypse has happened. The world is completely on its head. He has no clue what is going on in this strange foreign city he finds himself in. One other little bit that I think will help you get a little bit more out of the story. So the phrase he keeps hearing, and again, I'm going to have to copy and paste those. Change this to Polish. Sorry, such a process. So he's waiting in line. Well, he waits in line because he doesn't know what else to do. Right? He's wandering around this city trying to find something to eat. Has no idea what's going on. And he sees people lining up for some reason, and they're in line, and he sees that this woman is taking fish. Someone comes up in line, and the woman says, "Tu na żywo," a question, right? He has no idea what it means, right? This might as well be Egyptian hieroglyphs, right? This spoken language makes no sense to him, and he sees that when they nod their head, she cuts the fish's head off, uh, or they say najivo, and if that's the case, she just hands it to them and they put it in a bag and walk off. Um, Now, what the literal translation of this is here or alive. Okay, here or alive. So what she's saying is, do you want me to do what you want me to kill the fish here, or do you want to take it home alive? Right. Now this will come up later at the climax of the story. This cultural fact happening in front of them. And what is happening here that as an English speaker you may not know unless you know something about Polish culture is that even today, really, well, the fact of the tradition is that for Christmas Eve dinner, and Poles celebrate Christmas on Christmas Eve. Actually, they have their big dinner, they exchange presents on Christmas Eve. Christmas itself is the day of just doing nothing. That's the relaxed day. It's Christmas Eve evening when you have your big dinner and you exchange presents and all that. And um, according to Polish tradition, you can't eat meat for this meal, right? No meat is allowed. The only meat that you can eat is fish. So they have, they found tons of ways to make fish. They have fish salad, spiced fish, all this stuff. And unfortunately, it's carp. It's almost always carp, and I hate carp. I grew up eating tons of carp as a kid from Kansas, catfish and carp especially, and actually just catfish. And catfish now tastes like dirt to me. But carp, whenever you caught a carp, you threw it back or you threw it away. It was called a trash fish. It was really bony, and the meat wasn't good, and so you got rid of it. But Poles love carp. Maybe European carp is different, but it still tastes the same to me. And so when I celebrated Christmas with a family once, I actually bought a salmon and cooked a salmon myself so that, and I shared it obviously, but I wanted something that I could actually enjoy. So I made this big baked salmon with spices and whatnot, which they had never seen before. They had never thought of having a fish other than carp. And a lot of it goes to a history of poverty, right? What was the fish you could afford? Well, carp is very abundant in Poland, and so that's what you eat. And so it's this now. This tradition has probably died away a bit, but when I was in Poland, there were still people who would do this. It was cheaper to buy your carp like quite a quite a while before before Christmas Eve, and then you put it in your bathtub and let it grow. Right? It's cheaper to buy a small one and then take it home, put it in your bathtub, and feed it, and make it bigger. Right? And so that's what they would do. And this was a common practice for a long time. It's not that common anymore, but there are still people, especially out in the villages, who still do this. And so I have a lot of friends who remember growing up and having a carp in the tub. So, but as Anglophiles, as people who don't know anything about Polish culture, this would seem completely strange to us, right? We would have no frame of reference for what we're experiencing when we see a fish in a tub. So those are just the two big points that I wanted to tackle. Now, what I'd like you to do is go to our Sakai page, and I have put up a. It will be either below or above this video, and it is called. It's called "Close Reading Professor Andrews," and it's a Word doc, a Word document. So I'd like you to open that up. You can pause the video until you get it open, and I'm just going to read it aloud. Ideally, I'd love you to print it out and have it in front of you and take notes and whatnot, but it's fine. You can take notes on a piece of in a notebook or something as you look over it. I'm gonna read it aloud once, and then as I read, take notes, and then I'd like you to spend at least 5 minutes reading it yourself over and over again and making more notes. Okay, and then I'd like you to take 10 to 15 minutes to write a short paragraph about what you got out of it. What is the meaning of this text? And then once we do that, I'm going to show you what I got out of it, and you can compare notes. Save that paragraph that you write, and you'll post that into our discussion forum for today. So I'm going to share the screen, and I'll read it aloud once. The professor shakily stood up to go to the bathroom and found himself in the kitchen. On the table, there was some kind of complicated chemical apparatus, full of pipes and faucets. His stomach lurched from the strong smell, reminiscent of the vodka he had just drunk. A gentle push from his host put him in the direction of the toilet. The professor closed the door behind him, and when he turned around, he saw a huge fish swimming in the bathtub. It was alive. He didn't trust his eyes. He clutched the button on his pants and looked into its flat underwater eye. He felt trapped in its gaze. The fish moved its tail slowly. Laundry was drying on the racks above the tub. He stood there for probably 15 minutes, unable to move, until his worried host started to knock on the door. The professor quieted him. He and the fish gazed at each other. It was at once frightening and pleasant, completely rational and at the same time totally absurd. He was afraid and also in some strange way happy. The fish was alive. It moved. It pronounced some unheard words with its thick lips. Thick lips. Professor Andrews leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Oh, to stay in this tiny bathroom, in the stomach of this huge apartment building, in the center of this great frozen city, to be stripped of language, unable to understand or be understood, to look into the very center of that flat, miraculously round fisheye, not to move from this place. So you can pause the video here, do all your note taking and write your short paragraph. And when you unpause, I'll have a discussion of my reading and you can compare. So pause. Okay, so now you can open up. I've added what I'm about to show you into our discussion forum, so you can open this up, and I will share that. So these are the notes that I took on this. Now, an important thing to keep in mind when doing a close reading is that this is its own entity. You can put like a wall around it and analyze what's in it, but at the same time, you have to remember, you have to also consider the context in which this little piece of text is found. So this text doesn't exist on its own. It's part of a bigger story, right? It's part of a larger whole. And so what is the immediate whole that this is a part of? Well, if you look at the text right before this text begins, and then suddenly he became so starting on page 310. And then suddenly he became he suddenly became anxious. He remembered the embassy and began to mumble over and over again, "Embassy, British embassy, embassy." "War," the man answered him in English, and clutched it in the air in such a way that a machine gun practically materialized in his hands. The man crouched down, squinted his eyes, and made noises imitating gunfire. He shot at the fern-covered walls. "War," he repeated. So it's very important to know that this little piece of text happens right after that. Why? This is the reason that the professor freaks out, right? This is the last straw in his psychotic breakdown, right? So why does the guy say war, right? As good Polish historians, we know he means martial law. But in translation, martial law in Polish actually translates to state of war. So this old man doesn't speak any English, knows a couple words from here and there, probably speaks Russian. And he says the only thing he can to communicate, which is war. Now, try to imagine yourself in 1980 as a Westerner in a communist country. Okay. Now I know this is going to be difficult because you have no experience of this, but in 1980, that was like the height of the Cold War. I mentioned this in another episode, in another lecture. As kids, we would, whenever we would hear the siren go off for, the monthly test of the like the tornado warning, we would joke and say, "Oh my God, Reagan has dropped the bomb, right? He's pushed the button." Nuclear war was a daily threat to people. It was this dark cloud that hung over us constantly in the 80s. It was a very real possibility in a couple different moments. I mean, there are a bunch of movies from the watch War Games with Matthew Broderick. Great movie. I just rewatched it recently. It's still a great movie, and it will give you a bit of an idea about the cultural the zeitgeist of the zeitgeist of the time. Um, of the time is kind of redundant. I mean, that guy's means of the time. But anyway, so he sees this Polish guy say war, pretend to shoot a machine gun, and what is his first thought? Oh my God, the Soviet Union and the West are at war. It's World War III has just happened, right? That's the first thought that comes into his mind. Now we know that we're not at war with each other. The West and the East are not at war. That it's martial law, but that is the tragedy of miscommunication, of mistranslation, of not knowing another person's language, is the inability to communicate to such an extent that the person thinks that they're about to die, right? So that's important to keep in mind. This is kind of, again, a cultural thing that I marked. Complicated chemical apparatus full of pipes and faucets, the vodka he just drunk. So at the time, and even today, really, a lot of Poles make their own liquor. They make moonshine in their kitchens. And so, wait a minute. I did that wrong. I'm sorry. I just looked at my note here. So in the on my whiteboard, he doesn't say tu na żywo. he says, yeah, żywo czy na miejscu. Sorry about that. So żywo means alive, or na miejscu means on the spot is what it means. It's like here. Alive or here is what she's saying. Really, two is basically, it's almost a synonym for na miejscu here. So it means on the spot. And actually, this is why I wrote this in the notes, and I have to change my notes. That's really weird. I haven't seen that. I hadn't noticed that. When you go to a fast food place like McDonald's in Poland, they'll say na miejscu czy na wynos. Na miejscu means here. Na wynos means to go. So for out, basically. And so it's almost like that kind of, it's the same kind of phrase. Żywo czy na miejscu, right? So anyway, sorry about that. I got sidetracked there. Go back to our reading. So yeah, so just that's all that's happening. He's been given a little vodka to try to calm his nerves, and this vodka doesn't taste very good because it was made at home. It was made in a kitchen somewhere. Huge fish swimming in the bathtub. Again, this is linked back to the fish we saw earlier. This is a Christmas tradition that you have to know about in order to understand the story. The idea of it being alive, right? Alive or dead. This is an important thing throughout the tale, right? Is being alive or being dead. And one of the things is throughout his journey, he doesn't know if he's alive, right? He becomes so, he begins to have such a otherworldly experience that he's rather uncertain that he is alive at all. So the gaze, and then I wrote here existentialism. So existentialism is a school of philosophy, talks about existence, right? And identity creation for the existentialist is created in the acknowledgement, in the gaze between two people. Your identity isn't something that you come into the world with. Your identity is created in your interactions with other people, right? And so, but what's important for the existentialist is that this is human. This is a human interaction. This is a human activity to create identity, right? But who's he creating his identity from right now? He's in the gaze of an animal, of a dumb animal, of a primordial being, something that has no consciousness in a human way. Now that may be speciest, but I think we can agree that the catfish is not nearly as intelligent as the human, right? Because of the vagaries of evolution. But so here, he's this intelligence psychology professor, and he can't escape the gaze of a fish, right? So how low has he gotten, right? I checkmarked this because this is another thing that polls do that I think is really pretty brilliant. There's not a lot of spaces of premium in Poland, and so you dry your laundry where you can, and a lot of people have these really neat little inventions. They come down, they're on strings. You put your clothes on it, and then you raise them up with a cord, and they dry over the tub, right? Kind of brilliant. So he finds himself in this moment where language has caused him to think that he's about to die, that World War III has happened, and all of existence is about to disappear, right? And he hasn't spoken in over 15 minutes, right? He sees this fish, he can't stop looking at the fish, and the only sound he can make is shh, right? This is the only linguistic act he's able to do. Right? He speaks no words, okay? Now, we go on, he and the fish gazed at each other. Now, this is very important. To gaze at someone else is an act of agency, right? Especially for the existentialist, right? For a being to be able to gaze at another being, that denotes a level of consciousness, right? And one thing that separates us from animals is is human consciousness. Animals don't really gaze at us; they run off from us. They take us in a little bit, but they don't they don't recognize in us something, right? To gaze then is to give recognition to this being of its consciousness, and that's so the professor is trapped again in this gaze. Now this is a really important section, I think. It was at once frightening and pleasant, completely rational and at the same time totally absurd. He was afraid and also in some strange way happy. So it's a string of contradictions, right? Now, a contradiction is impossible. For two polar opposite things to exist at the same time in one spot is an impossibility, right? Something cannot be frightening and pleasant. It cannot be rational and absurd, right? So what's happened here? With this string of contradictions, reality itself isn't real anymore. Reality has broken down in the professor's mind. He has no if something is rational and absurd, it isn't, right? And so his entire existence now is in question. Existence itself is suddenly in question in his mind, right? So again, it repeats alive. Alive comes up again. So this is also important. So it pronounced some unheard words, right? So the fish pronounces some unheard words. Now, earlier, just a bit earlier, he had said shh. That was the only language act he could perform is shh, right? He couldn't say words. But the fish suddenly has a language. Now, obviously fish don't have language, right? But what he sees happen when this fish opens its mouth and bubbles come out, he attributes it as having some kind of as though having some kind of language. And language is the marker of consciousness, right? To actually have language and communication, this is the core of human consciousness. And he's describing it to this fish, and he doesn't even have language, right? He can't make use of language anymore. And so in the great chain of being, old medieval idea, he's actually below the fish now, right? And what are fish? They're our ancestors. They're not our ancestors. We are the ancestors of fish, right? We have evolved past fish, and yet here he has devolved, right? I think I say no. I don't say that somewhere. I say regression, right? So he has devolved below a fish, right? He has regressed, right? He has become a pre-linguistic being, okay? Um, and what is a pre-linguistic being? What is a pre-linguistic human? Well, let's look. So he says, oh, to stay in this tiny bathroom in the stomach of this huge apartment building, in the center of this great frozen city, to be stripped of language, unable to understand or be understood, right? So this is actually where he's found himself. He is in this bathroom in the stomach of this building, the center of a city, stripped of language. He has no language now. He is unable to understand or be understood, right? He is a pre-linguistic being. And what are pre-linguistic humans? Babies. So what does he want right now? So he says, "Oh, to stay in this tiny bathroom." So he's wishing he could do this, right? He's wishing for this. But what is he really wishing for? To be back in the womb. He wants to be in his mother's womb again, right? In the stomach, in the center, stripped of language, right? He wants his mommy. Things have gone so completely awful for him that he wants his mommy, right? That's all he can express. And so to have your mommy again is to go back into the womb, to be in the one safe place in the universe where you have no knowledge of anything, right? Is to be back in the womb of your mother, right? So that's what I got out of it. And this especially this part, well, the lack of language, the idea of devolving below a fish, the idea of wanting to return to the womb, this comes right out of psychoanalysis, psychology, especially Freudian psychology, and that's what Tokarczuk is trained in. So she's taking Freudian psychology and writing a brilliant story about it. Really, she's explaining Freud through a short work of fiction, which I think is just genius. So that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed the stories, especially this one. Tokarczuk is an amazing author. If you would like to read more about Tokarczuk, you could buy my book or borrow it from the library and read my chapter on her. But anyway, thank you, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say. Bye-bye.